Hello, John.
Hey, Bill, how you doing?
Oh, fine. You're listening to Meaning of Life TV. I'm Bill Black, a visiting instructor of history here at Western Kentucky University. And I'm talking today to John Fia, professor of history at Messiah College. And that's in, where is that? In Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania?
Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. It's about 10 miles outside of Harrisburg, which is the state capital.
Gotcha. Yeah. How far is it from Gettysburg?
Just west of the Susquehanna River.
Gotcha. You're the author of several books, including The Bible Cause, A History of the American Bible Society. What we're going to talk about today is this really handsome book, I think, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, published by Eerdmans. Is that how you say it?
Eerdmans, yeah.
Eerdmans. And before we get into that, I wanted to talk to you first. This is something that just happened a few days ago. We're recording this Monday after Thanksgiving. For people who maybe are listening to this a year later, there's a missionary named John Chow who he was attempting to share the gospel with native people of North Sentinel Island, which is part of India. It's actually kind of closer to Burma, way out in the Bay of Bengal, or however you say that. And there are people who haven't had very much contact at all with the outside world, and India doesn't legally allow people to contact these folks. And it seems like Chow lied when he was applying for a visa, saying he was coming to India as a travel blogger. We make a long story short, he tried to make contact with the North Sentinelese, and they killed him. And I was curious, John, what thoughts he had on his death, and perhaps even more on the media tales of his death, in light of, you've talked about people who were martyrs of their own kind for the American Bible Society, and curious what your take on this was.
It's just, the whole thing is just a tragic, it's just a tragic story for me, as I see it. One of the things that I've noticed about the way in which, I haven't seen much media coverage on it, but I have been kind of hosting I did a blog post on it, among a lot of academics are kind of weighing in. I'd encourage you to go, and the listeners here to go and find, I did a blog post on it, but Kate Carte, who is an American religious historian at Southern Methodist University, Carte, C-A-R-T-E, did a long Twitter storm on this. I think it was about 29 tweets connecting it with Thanksgiving, because this happens right before Thanksgiving, and making some historical connections between the ways in which European imperialism affected the Native Americans in Plymouth, and just in the American colonial experience, the British colonial experience generally. And in some ways, she was very, very hard on the missionary in that sense, as a kind of agent of colonialism, an agent of imperialism in that sense. And a lot of the conversation that emerged on my Facebook page and elsewhere really kind of jumped on that kind of bandwagon. That's, I guess, one way of looking at this. I mean, what I think is at stake here are two different ways of viewing the world, is strikingly on display in the way people are thinking about this. Like, if you're not a Christian and you don't have any appreciation for evangelism, or what the New Testament, what Matthew 28 in the Bible talks about, go out into all the world and make disciples, like Jesus commanded all Christians to do, you're going to see this guy as an imperialist, as someone who is invading the space. I think Kate actually calls him a terrorist who's invading the simple lifestyle of the so-called noble savages on this island. If you are a Christian, I don't necessarily think that you can assume that this was a perfect example of missionary activity either. In some ways, at least you can understand what this guy is trying to do. He's trying to bring what he believes to be a life-changing message to the people, to these inhabitants of this island. On the other hand, I think a lot of what Chow tries to do is very reflective of kind of the rampant individualism of American evangelicalism. I mean, this guy was a lone wolf. He was not sent by anyone. He was not sent by a church. He wasn't sent by a missionary organization. The idea of missions, as someone pointed out on my page, is the idea of being part of or being sent by someone else, and so in some ways this guy, he very much reflects this kind of spirit of kind of do-it-yourself individualism. He's not connected with any kind of sending body. So the whole thing is just tragic. I think there's criticisms to be made of evangelical missions and him and his philosophy here and his approach. I think we need to be careful though calling this guy a terrorist or someone who wants to kind of bring some kind of Western imperialism to this country too. I think you can separate in some ways the passion for conversion and wanting to bring a message to these people and kind of him as an agent of kind of the West. So that's my preliminary take. I'm still thinking through a lot of this.
Well, I suppose another part of it, besides kind of a cultural or imperialism, is the fear of spreading disease.
Yeah.
People who are not.
And I think that's fair. I think that if there is a kind of sending body or a church or even Christians in India, who know about this. I mean, this kid did not, 26-year-old man actually did not really think through all the implications. Was kind of like a blind zeal to reach these people, and I think that's unfortunate, and I think that's one of the worst problems of this kind of evangelical kind of proselytizing.
And here I'm afraid I might sound a bit like the village atheist, but
yeah.
What would you say? 'Cause I would say I grew up more mainline. The denomination I'm in is a sort of weird. Presbyterians are kind of halfway between mainline and evangelical. In the context of suburban Memphis, we identified, I would say, kind of more as main Protestant. So how would you say, and maybe it's even hard to say most, but evangelical position on fate of so-called heathens? And by heathens, I don't mean that as a derogatory term, but simply the descriptor of people who have not heard the gospel. Yeah. People who are in this, they have not rejected the gospel because they have not heard it. What's the position? What happens to heathens who die without having heard the gospel?
Well, it depends on what aspects of evangelical theology you're talking about. I think traditionally, coming out of American fundamentalism and most conservative evangelicals would say if you die without having heard the gospel, you are, this is eternity is at stake. You're going to spend eternity in hell. I think is what many conservative evangelicals position on this. There's no real mystery, in all of this. It's either you've heard or you haven't heard. Some of this, evangelicals often talk about this similarly in terms of babies who die without kind of reaching what they would call an age of accountability. That God sometimes makes a special dispensation for a child who was unable to kind of make an intellectual or emotional assent to the kind of faith. So I don't know. I mean, I'll just tell you what many evangelicals would say. And if you believe that these people are going to hell without hearing the gospel, it at least allows you to understand why, through much of the 19th and 20th century, the evangelical heroes of the faith are the missionaries, like Jim and Elizabeth Elliot among the Ecuador tribes. These were people, I think, in the 1950s 50s, I'll probably get that wrong, who were killed by natives, indigenous peoples. And, these are great martyrs of the faith. Now, Jim and Elizabeth Elliot were sent by churches and so forth. This guy just seemed to be on his own kind of, it's this strange combination of kind of evangelical missionary culture and kind of the adrenaline adventure kind of culture that's so celebrated among millennials today, the kind of, it's just this, the whole thing is just, it's going to take a while, I think, for me to make sense of it all.
Yeah. Well, I know there's this phenomenon of sort of Instagram missionaries, people who, aren't acting within any organization, but, call themselves missionaries, and they build social media followings, and that's they raise money, and they're having this aesthetic, pleasing pictures of themselves and the exotic locales where they are.
Yeah, I think that's what this is part of. I mean, most people in evangelical churches will see this man as a courageous kind of hero. I think most lay people in evangelical churches will see Chow as some kind of, he was called to do this. God called him. And, you'll also hear a little bit of this. You'll hear a kind of what I call a planting seeds argument, right? In other words, this guy was irresponsible, but, maybe God used him, you'll hear, for the purpose of kind of this initial contact that he made, even the words, I think he said, Jesus loves you or something like that. Even this one encounter will sort of somehow plant a seed for later missionaries or something to reach these people. You'll hear a lot of that kind of theologizing about this guy's attempts. But I think in terms of the way it's being debated, there seems to be no middle ground. Either this guy was called by God to do this, and how dare you criticize him for his faith, or versus the kind of more secular left who would say, this is an example of imperialism and so forth. And I think that debate is the way it's been polarized is kind of unfortunate. In some ways, it's reflective of our sort of polarized culture on a number of things in this day and age.
Right, and I mean, was it the Elliots in the 50s? Ecuador, was that their name?
Yeah, Jim, and I'm going to look this up for you real quick. Jim and Elizabeth Elliot.
But I know it's been pointed out that they were pretty universally within the mainstream press.
This was a very different world in which they lived in. Where there wasn't a whole lot of kind of the secular left. 1956. There wasn't a whole lot of kind of a strong. This is the 1950s, right? A missionary gets killed among Ecuadorian Indians, and this is a sort of national tragedy. In some ways, we're not living in 2016. I mean, we're living in an age of kind of, still American imperialism around the world, the Cold War, America spreading American ideals and values. And we're largely operating in a nation that is predominantly controlled by Christians. This is the age of Eisenhower and one nation under God. And so I don't think you'd see the same degree of pushback from non-Christians in the way that you would see with the Elliots.
Well, this makes me think, sort of tying now into your book, which came out just a few months ago. Is that right? June.
Yeah. June 2018.
So still a little baby.
Yeah.
But you highlight sort of three main themes in sort of evangelical thinking, and I should say that by evangelical, you're mostly talking about white evangelicals,
right?
Though I guess you probably also be including, say, some Latino and Black evangelicals who attend majority white evangelical churches.
Yeah, I'm basing my kind of, when I say white evangelicals, I'm largely basing this on the polling numbers, the exit polling numbers, which said that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump.
And I should say that your acknowledgments, so you dedicate this to the 19%.
19%, those who did not, yes.
But one of those themes that you highlight that you think helps explain why evangelicals supported Trump, which is still this big question that, we're asking, is nostalgia.
Yeah.
When you're talking about how the media portrayed the Elliots in the 1950s, reminded me of that. Because I could imagine, and maybe we're already hearing this, nostalgia creeping into, there was a time when John Chow would have just been universally and respected. And now he's being called, a dangerous person, terrorist, people even sort of championing his death, I've seen in a kind of a schadenfreude way. Yeah. So why do you think nostalgia is one of the reasons why so many evangelicals supported Trump?
Yeah. I think nostalgia can be a good thing at times. I mean, I often say when I speak about the book, my wife thinks that I'm the most nostalgic person she's ever met. It's this longing for this golden age when it seems like everything was well and good with the world. So, I don't like the designated hitter rule in baseball, so I can wax nostalgic about the years before the designated hitter rule, even though I was only like 7 years old, right? I don't remember any.
Can join in on that.
You remember the kind of family get-togethers and so forth, and where everything seemed right with the world when you were a young kid, and you forget about all the sort of dysfunction that was going on in that room as well. So nostalgia can help us, I think, make sense of our own lives and stuff, but it's ultimately a very kind of narcissistic, to use a word that's popular lately, a narcissistic way of looking at the past, because you're always looking at the things that made you feel warm and fuzzy. Right. And you're not thinking in a kind of common good kind of way in which you're thinking about like what was the world like then for people other than yourself. Mm-hmm. So evangelicals have a long history of this kind of nostalgia. I mean, in some ways it really begins in the early 19th century when many of them are nostalgic for a Christian founding. And much of it is tied in with that ongoing understanding that evangelicals have that America was founded as a Christian nation, this kind of nationalism, right? That the founding fathers wanted to create a Christian nation. And then if you replace nostalgia with good history, like I think many evangelicals do, then you get into a political philosophy built upon nostalgia in which you're constantly trying to reclaim or restore or renew something that may have never existed in the first place, or if it did exist in the past, it's now kind of long gone. So I think there's this kind of city on a hill, American exceptionalism idea that's deeply rooted in the heart of the American evangelical experience. Other historians like Mark Knoll have written about this. It's very, very hard to separate the American evangelical experience from American nationalism. And when you have this kind of convergence of these two things and you build a political philosophy around it in the way that, say, the moral majority did in the 1970s and continues to that philosophy continues to be effective today, you are going to have people, again, longing for a past age. So evangelical politics is constantly going to be looking backward. Make America great again, right? As a historian, I'm always focused less on the word great and more on again, right? You tell me when America was great, and then I'll step in to the conversation as a historian, and we can talk about what that age that you think was great was really like. Yeah.
I think one way you do that's interesting is you point out that evangelicals tend to cite certain moments in the 60s and 70s for when they sort of, when there was this kind of downfall of a Christian America. They cite, Engel versus Vitale, or however you pronounce that.
Right.
Supreme Court decision to take prayer out of schools. Abington versus Shemp, taking the Bible out of schools, and of course, Roe v. Wade. But you say that you argue that they often downplay how important the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 was, and Green versus Conley in 1972. And I was curious, what do you think the history of kind of modern evangelical politics looks like when you take those events into account, as well as the Supreme Court cases that we're probably more familiar with when we hear debate over religious liberty.
Yeah. Well, in the 1970s, a particular narrative emerged among the Christian right, and some of it is accurate. What's fascinating to me always is in the 1950s, you have America going through a so-called, kind of a spiritual revival in the wake of World War II. You have the Eisenhower years that we talked about, that age of Elizabeth Elliot and Jim Elliot and so forth. But the Supreme Court seems to be working in an opposite direction. While the country is growing and increasingly becoming more religious and more people are attending church, the Supreme Court seems to be moving in a direction that is kind of much more about separating church from state in a more clear and definitive way. So that's where you get Abington and Schempp and Engel v. Vital, the cases that you just talked about. The Hart-Celler Act is really, really interesting because, as some of your viewers may know, this was an act that opened up the doors to Middle Eastern, Asian, African immigrants to a degree that the United States has never seen. By the 1970s, it's going to lead to, and especially into the 80s, it's going to lead to unprecedented diversity within the United States. And of course, all of these immigrants who are coming are bringing their religion with them, which in most cases is not Christian. So I think that, that's often not mentioned in the narrative of the Christian right, but that's certainly part of it. And this creates a certain degree of fear that the Christian nation, that these the Christian nationalists are want to defend, may be threatened or may be eroding. Green v. Connolly is a very interesting case. The historian Randall Balmer made a big deal of this in some of his writing, particularly his biography of Jimmy Carter, and the role that this played in the creation of the Christian right. Green v. Connolly was a case in which Bob Jones University, a segregationist Christian university in Greenville, South Carolina, along with dozens of other segregated Christian K through 12 academies,
and these are schools that are created sort of soon after Brown versus Board, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're in resistance to private academies to sort of resist the integration of Brown versus Board. The Supreme Court basically rules in Green v. Connolly that these institutions have to desegregate or allow people of color, African American students in, or else they will lose their tax exempt status. And there's a very, very strong reaction among Southerners to Green v. Connolly. It'll eventually become known as the Bob Jones case. It's often referred to as colloquially. And the thing is this is where conservative evangelicals of the South, begin to start emphasizing this kind of big government as a threat to their individual liberties. In this case, it's the individual liberty of their school to be able to segregate based upon religious belief. So, they see this as, and many of their arguments are almost identical to the arguments that the Confederacy made about the so-called Northern invasion into the South before the Civil War. But essentially what it is you have, we need to stop big government from interfering in our religious beliefs, in this case, segregation. So I think that also creates a certain degree of fear. Balmer argues that this was what the primary issue that started the Christian right as a movement, or the moral majority as a movement. And I see it as a little more things are at work than just this one case. But certainly the point is, race in both the Hart-Celler and the Green-Connolly Acts, a Green-Connolly decision and the Hart-Celler Act, race is at work. You'd be blind not to see race at work in the creation of this kind of Christian view of politics that I would argue has been is still very much prevalent, was very much prevalent in 2016 when so many evangelicals turned to Donald Trump.
Yeah, curious also, do you think that the importance of the abortion issue is, do you think it's exaggerated at all, or do you think it's sort of only, it seems like that's what we typically hear about, and yet I know that some have said the history is a little blurrier there, that evangelicals initially sort of perceived it as more of a Catholic issue. What role do you think abortion has in that?
Well, evangelicals do get on the abortion bandwagon in the 1970s in a way they hadn't before. I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention, actually supported Roe versus Wade, because they supported it as like government should not be legislating morality, right? Yeah. The federal government should not be telling us how we should not be telling us whether or not we should have an abortion or not. It's really not till the 70s when Jerry Falwell and others, thanks to, I think the key player here is a Christian evangelical intellectual named Francis Schaeffer, who is able to help Jerry Falwell and other leaders of the Christian right think about abortion as a life issue that evangelicals should be concerned about. Prior to this, of course, it was always viewed as a Catholic issue, as you mentioned. I think abortion remains the number one issue for, you can talk about, you could talk about race, you could talk about, all of these other things, and I think they're a part of it. But at the top of the list remains abortion. Usually there's a secondary cause for Christian nationalists, depending on the year. We've seen it this year. It's religious liberty as defined by Christian Americans, Christian nationalists, I should say. In other words, we've seen gay marriage or homosexuality, or we've seen stem cell research, or, some secondary issue that becomes a hot ballot issue. But at the heart of the Christian right's political playbook, which is still being executed, was still executed by conservative evangelicals in 2016, is abortion. Donald Trump promised to appoint Supreme Court justices who would overturn, or at least would be conservative in the hopes of overturning Roe versus Wade. And I feel that is the main number one reason why evangelicals turned to him. I don't think it's the only reason, but I think it's the most important reason. It continues to remain the hot button issue for conservative evangelicals of a certain age. The average age of the Trump voter was 57. I don't know what the average age of Trump evangelical voters were, but I'm guessing it's around the same age. These were people who were schooled in the political playbook put forth by Jerry Falwell and others in the late 70s and 80s about how to change the culture, how to influence the culture for God or for the gospel or for Christianity. So I think abortion still remains that issue. And in some ways, I argue, it's become a paralyzing issue. It leads evangelicals into the hands of people like Donald Trump when you only have that one issue as your most important. And I think there's been a lot of evangelicals who have thought through this in a deeper way, thought about life issues in a more complex way, a way that's more, just not driven by, one moral issue. The old saying that, there are many evangelical Christians who have tried to put forth a political agenda in which life is not only when the baby's in the womb, but after life after the baby is born too. Right. What do those policies look like? And for the most part, and this goes to the success of the Christian right in America. Frankly, I don't think they get enough attention in the history books, the Christian right. Jerry Falwell may be one of the most important figures in American politics. Jerry Falwell Sr., I'm talking about, right? The founder of the Moral Majority. He may be one of the most important political figures in post-World War II America because he's taught millions and millions of conservative evangelicals, which now represent about a quarter of the population, white conservative evangelicals, to vote in a certain way. And it's been an amazing success. It's been a major story in American political history that only gets like a paragraph, at least in my U.S. survey textbook.
Well, and I think people who, live in certain parts of the country, I don't think they take, this question of abortion seriously enough. I think, if you truly believe that, I don't know how many millions of babies are being murdered every year, then if you believe that, then it's going to be very hard to propose some sort of compromise. If it were just common practice that 1-year-olds were killed just sort of this was legal, and someone said, well, vote for me and I promise I will make the murder of 1-year-olds legal and rare. That which is that's sort of the line that Democrats have used to try and appeal to. I would not be very convinced by that, and I find it's a hard thing to find any kind of common ground on.
Right. The problem here though is less about abortion being a moral problem, because it is. I would argue. We would never think of killing 1-year-olds. We would never then think of like, oh, we want to respect the choice of the mother to kill, right? The choice of the parent, right? I know this isn't a fair analogy, right? But there
are people for whom that analogy is perfect, right? I mean, there are people, and I think it's important to keep in mind that is what many Americans believe is pretty much happening.
Yeah, for me, it's not an issue of abortion. I think abortion is a moral wrong. In that sense, you could call me pro-life. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with the pro-life political agenda, because they've thrown all their eggs in one basket, right? The Supreme Court and overturning Roe versus Wade. In many ways, the overturning of Roe versus Wade is not going to end abortion in America. In fact, a recent statistic came out last week that says abortion is actually at an all-time low since Roe v. Wade. It spiked initially after Roe v. Wade, and now it's reached an all-time low. That's still, I think it's like 700,000, or I don't know the number. It's still, people would say, well, one is horrible enough. But what happens is, by just throwing all of your money, all of your support, all of your resources behind electing the right candidates, you end up with competing moral problems. That means you have to endorse a person like Donald Trump. What if we were to think about abortion and ending and limiting the number of, and I'm a pragmatist on this, right? I don't think you're ever going to end abortion, but what happens? How do you reduce the number of abortions? What role does the church play? What role does nonprofits play? What role does a bunch of other approaches play in kind of ending that? And why aren't we investing our time, our energies, and our resources more fully? Because there is work being done in this area on those kinds of things. So it's not an issue. I just think the overturning Roe versus Wade kind of forces us to get in bed with, get evangelicals in bed with monsters like Donald Trump. And next thing you know, we're having to justify other life issues, like separating babies from their parents on the border of Mexico, or the way we treat people of color. The administration treats people of color, or the comments that he makes, or the environment. Slipping that environmental report on the Friday, it was the Wednesday night or the Thursday, Friday, during Thanksgiving, when no one's going to look at it. All of these issues are life issues. Poverty is a life issue. So I want to push evangelicals to kind of think a little bit more deeply. As an evangelical myself, I want my tribe to think a little more deeply about some creative solutions to life issues, and also creative solutions to trying to end abortion, so that we're not just finding ourselves locked into some kind of political power play to do this, to get this accomplished.
Well, sort of to shift gears, I want to ask, I think when Trump, during the Republican primary, people, I think, were surprised at how quickly Trump was able to build a base of evangelical voters. And you argue that it's because he tapped into a sort of segment of evangelicalism that, was sort of hadn't received much national attention. So whereas Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, they turn to sort of, how would you describe them? You describe them as people sort of in the Wheaton College, Baylor University universe.
Yeah, like the white evangelical kind of middle class, brought up in the Christian with the kind of Christian sensibilities of the Christian right. Kind of middle class, lower middle class.
Right.
Send their kids to Christian colleges, right?
And you, which, honestly is not so much. I mean, I grew up in the Memphis suburb, and I went to school with people like that. I was probably more kind of working class.
Yeah.
People I knew very few people who would describe themselves as evangelical. That was not really a word I heard often. It was a word that you would hear sort of used by political pundits.
Right.
People would describe themselves as Baptist.
Yeah.
I would even hear words like conservative or even fundamentalist used in conversation than evangelical. And I almost think, I think there's something different when you're somewhere. It's almost like a fish not knowing what water is, where just so many people are just kind of broadly evangelical. I think they relate to it differently than, say, people who send their kids to Wheaton or Baylor or Calvin College, places like that.
I think evangelical. The word evangelical, you're right about not many people knowing what that word means. And
oh goodness,
it's very northern. I think it's it's regional stuff at work. I think it's a very northern idea.
Well, I've heard it argued that evangelical was a term kind of coined to to start using that instead of fundamentalist, because fundamentalist is sort of tainted with the sort of circus of the Scopes trial and
the sort of separatism, the kind of anti-intellectualism. An evangelical is a fundamentalist. This is playing off of George Morrison's famous line where he said, a fundamentalist is an evangelical who's mad at someone, right?
Right.
An evangelical, as they emerge as they're often described themselves as the new evangelicals in the 1940s and 50s, people like Billy Graham and Fuller Theological Seminary, Christianity Today magazine, and other theologians like Carl Henry or E.J. Carnell. These are names that are kind of getting in the weeds now a little bit. These people describe themselves as the new evangelicals. They were essentially fundamentalists in their theology, but they weren't mad at anyone, right? They wanted to engage the culture. So in many ways, that was a predominantly kind of northern movement. Southern Baptists certainly embraced similar kinds of fundamentalist theology, but didn't necessarily embrace the word evangelical in the way that many northern evangelicals kind of did. Because Southern Baptists were always kind of rooted in a denomination, while northern evangelicalism was very sort of trans-denominational or interdenominational. You believed certain things, right? You believed in, to use the famous David Bebbington definition of what an evangelical was. An evangelical was someone who believed in the centrality of the cross, that Jesus died for your sins. They believed in conversion, the idea that you have to accept Jesus as your savior, right? A personal conversion experience. There would be people who believed in the Bible as the word of God, the inspired word of God. And then they would believe in activism, or going out and preaching that message, like this Chow guy did in India, in this Indian island. So, I do think you see people who would embrace those theological ideas in both the North and the South. Among the Southern Baptist Church, any Southern Baptist in, say, the 1950s would say, oh, if that's an evangelical, I'm an evangelical, right? So the word has a complicated history, I think. When they use it in political, and this is what I've learned from my political scientist friends, when they use it politically nowadays, it's really in exit polls. And what they do is when someone comes out of the voting booth, they ask them, are you an evangelical Christian? Are you an evangelical or born again Christian? playing on that aspect of the Bebington quadrilateral, the conversionism, right? Are you a born-again Christian? And if they answer yes, then they say, well, who'd you vote for? Donald Trump. And then, that's how it works. So it's an imperfect system because it doesn't tell you how serious they are about their faith or whether they go to church or, whether it's just a cultural idea. Yeah, of course I'm born again, right? Yeah. So the 81% is a problematic number. And I'm not really necessarily even wed to the 81% as a number. I just think the number, whether it's 60%, 50%, I think that's still too high.
Right.
It's part of my argument. Yeah.
Some evangelicals, I think, have used that line of argument to sort of distance themselves so that it becomes a no Scotsman sort of thing. That any evangelical who said so they supported Trump, well, they weren't really an evangelical churchgoer. They're not really representative. Yeah. And I know Tim Glegg had a piece sort of analyzing that. Yeah. But I did want to get your thoughts, though. So if Trump didn't really build his sort of network within that self-identified evangelical, the movement that came out of the 50s, 60s, new evangelicalism movement. Yeah. Instead, he built it within something I hadn't really heard of, the independent network charismatic movement.
Yeah.
Something that he really thrived in and tapped into, a contingent that other people hadn't. Right. Tell us what that means.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I would say this. Bill. I mean, it's not that certain members of the old traditional Christian right, conservative evangelicals, they supported Rubio and Cruz and Carson. Of course, though, they turned to Trump in the general election because Trump. You go back, then you execute the playbook, right? Hillary's pro-choice, Trump's defending pro-life issues, so you turn that way. So even the more middle class white evangelicals who send their kids to Christian colleges and so forth are going to vote for. Many of them are going to vote for Trump in the general election. The independent network charismatics are probably one of the fastest growing groups of, I guess you could call them evangelicals because they believe those tenets of the Bebington quadrilateral that I just stated. They are a fascinating group in that they revolve around what are called prophets. So you have these prophets who claim to have sort of direct revelation to God and have visions, and they prophesy about things and God speaks to them. And they have these very, very large congregations, sometimes numbering, in the United States, 30, 40,000 people. They often meet, they're not all in one place at one time. They have video, they want, he preaches and then it's spread out over videos in other locations and part of the congregation. One of these guys, Mike Bickle, his name is, has a huge congregation in the Kansas City area, which meets at multiple satellite locations. It's also booming internationally, especially in Latin America, Central America, South America, Brazil, Korea. South Korea has, a congregation apparently of over 100,000 people. It comes out of the Pentecostal or charismatic movements, so they believe that the spiritual gifts promised to people speaking in tongues, prophesying, raising the dead, all these kinds of things are applicable for today. And it's also directly connected to the prosperity gospel. There's some overlap there where the idea is that God blesses those, with material, the faithful God will bless with material, prosperity. So Trump tapped into this, and a part of it was they tapped into Trump before Trump tapped into them. There are several of these so-called prophets who claim to have visions, some dating back as early as 2007, that Donald Trump would be the president of the United States. He would be a new King Cyrus in the Bible, someone who was going to save, Cyrus in the Bible released the Israelites from captivity in Persia. Previously, they were captive in Babylon. When the Persian Empire overtook the Babylonian Empire, Cyrus was the king and released them to go back to the promised land. You see these prophecies saying that, Trump is the new King Cyrus who's going to free Americans from the so-called captivity of the Obama age or whatever that might be. Right. and that he is going to be someone who's going to restore America to its Christian nation, and in some ways usher in part of God's plan for ushering in the second coming of Christ. So there's this idea that they're very kind of post-millennial, and the idea that, you know, certain things have to happen prophetically before Jesus will return. So they often revolve around certain institutions, like they have no denominational control over these institutions, these big mega churches. You often find them they have television ministries that are usually regional, and they also turn to Charisma magazine, which is the magazine that reflects a lot of their views, which has a huge, I don't know if this is true or not, but I saw some statistic where Charisma magazine has a circulation of over 250,000 print subscription, which is, I don't know if that's true, but it's massive. So these kinds of people, they see these prophets as kind of having a direct hotline to God. And if the prophet says that indeed Donald Trump was anointed by God to serve the United States for such a time as this, as they would quote from the book of Esther, then he must be, this is God moving and God working in the world. So they've played a particular role, an important role in mobilizing. They did these prayer walks. Many of them traveled all throughout the contested states, the so-called Hillary firewall states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. They traveled through praying in each district that, people would come out and support Donald Trump, and they believe that their prayers were successful in getting him elected.
What was her? There's one particular, is it Paula
White?
I know she's often cited as.
Yeah, Paula White is much more of a more prosperity gospel preacher than necessarily Independent Network Charismatics. She certainly is a charismatic, but she sort of staked her claim much more along the prosperity gospel lines. I think many prosperity Christians, people who believe that God will bless them with material wealth if they're obedient to him, really see Donald Trump as somebody who, because he's so wealthy and successful, and again, that in and of itself could be debated, but because they see him as being wealthy and successful, that God must be blessing him in some way. And Paula White, of course, is also the one who claims to have prayed with Donald Trump and helped to convert him to Christianity. She's the one who told that to James Dobson, the family focus on the family values, evangelical Christian, who then talked about Trump being a baby Christian, right? Who just got saved or just got born again. So Paula White has been a close spiritual advisor to Trump for a while now.
Well, here's a question for you. So, comparing Trump to Cyrus, Cyrus was not an Israelite. He was not Jewish, right? I mean, part of rationale for comparing him to Cyrus is that, well, he's not one of us, but God is using him.
Yeah.
And yet
he was a pagan king.
Right, but how many evangelicals, though, do you think really do see Trump as a pagan king? Have you heard people say, "Oh, I'm not really sure he's actually Christian, but I don't care," or I just think God's using him?
I think the evangelical community split on this one, at least the pro-Trump evangelical world. Sure. Here I'm talking about the rabid pro-Trumpers. The Paula Whites of the world. Paula White, I think, firmly believes that he's a Christian, and God is using him as a Christian to carry out, the purposes of the gospel or the church in the world. There's others, for example, someone like Robert Jeffress, from the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, or even Franklin Graham, the son of the late evangelist Billy Graham, who would say, sure, Trump has his problems. Sure, Trump is a sinner. I don't know if Trump has accepted Jesus as his savior or not. But God, like Cyrus, God uses imperfect people to carry out his plan. So they would say it really does. They would say it really doesn't matter whether Trump's a Christian or not. He is faith-friendly, and God is using him in this kind of incredible way. God uses sinners, and God uses people who have these corrupt lives or immoral lives to carry out his purposes. God's ways are not our ways, would be the argument. And while we would think that it should be a godly Christian leader to help us, sometimes God has other plans, would be the idea here. So you get a kind of mixed views on that, depending on which pro-Trump evangelical you talk to.
Well, and I'm reminded, I grew up hearing a lot of people who were evangelicals saying something that was basically the reverse about Jimmy Carter, where they would completely grant that Jimmy Carter was a devout Christian, and even argue that he was a bad president because he was a good Christian. He was to be a good president because he wasn't willing to kick ass and take names, I guess. Right. I don't know if you've encountered or.
Carter's interesting because evangelicals did flock to him in 1976. I know
my Trump supporting Baptist aunts, they voted for Carter in 76 and 80.
Yeah. I mean, and even Gerald Ford in 76 claimed to be some kind of an evangelical Christian too. So that's very interesting. But Carter was so kind of authentic, right? He talked about being born again. Even his statement about like being tempted to lust from women, was it appealed to certain evangelicals, right? That this guy's honest and true.
They knew what he meant. They knew what language he was
speaking. They knew what he meant. And I think what happened was when Carter, several things. I mean, one, just, that you can't count out the economy, the recession and so forth. Also, Carter just did not deliver on the things that evangelicals hoped he would. We talked earlier about the Green-Connolly, the Bob Jones case. Jimmy Carter supported the Supreme Court on that. He wanted to desegregate these academies. And this there was opposition that emerged almost immediately to Carter when it didn't look like he would deliver on abortion, overturn Roe v. Wade, try to keep the segregation in place in these academies. So, this is where Falwell and others, many of you know the story, many of your listeners will know the story. This is where Falwell and others kind of say, no, we thought this guy was going to help our moral cause, and he doesn't seem to be doing it. So yeah, Carter's a fascinating character. I think it's probably true to say the fact that he tried to actually live out a kind of authentic evangelicalism probably did hurt his presidency. I mean, he has that famous 1979 malaise speech in which, he says, we are a nation that is self-centered, selfish. We only care about each other. We don't think about the common good, and then Reagan comes in and just says, do whatever you want, right? Individualism, freedom, right? Freedom of religion, all these kinds of things. No one wants to hear the message of self-discipline that Carter puts forth, which, is an authentically Christian message, but I think that says a lot about the evangelical electorate as well. Yeah.
Well, I got one more question then we'll wrap up. I know there's been debates in the Democratic Party about what's the right calculus to defeat Trump in 2020, and there's one sidebar in that debate is how much should they try and win over people who voted for Trump?
Yeah.
And a part of that is, is it worth trying to talk to some evangelicals who voted for Trump and to appeal to them? Appeal to their values, their professed. And I'm curious what you think about that. Yeah.
I mean, I wrote a whole book about this, so I hope there's a possibility.
Sure.
Look, I see those 81% as very, there's diversity within that 81%. One of the things I worry about with the media is that they don't see the diversity of the 81%. That 81% includes the rabid Trump supporters who are evangelicals, the people who go to the rallies, the people who supported this guy in the primaries when there were other options, the GOP primaries. the people who wear the MAGA hats. I mean, there's a lot of evangelicals. I remember when Trump came to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm watching the news coverage on it at night, local news coverage. And, I see like 4 or 5 people from my church in line, my evangelical church in line, right? So there's that group. What I found after doing close to 20 or 30 book talks, and I'm on the road a lot with this book, is that many of those people are just not going to be convinced by kind of rational arguments. Politics is often so much emotional, and it's just going to be hard to convince those people. However, there's a large number, and I don't know what the percentage is, but I also find there's a large number who just don't like Donald Trump. They wish they didn't have to vote for him. They hated Hillary Clinton even more. They kind of walk the line between not voting for the president and voting for Trump, right? Or voting for a third party candidate and voting for Trump, and they decided that they were going to vote for Trump. It's those kind of people that I hope my book is going to reach, and get them to sort of rethink, especially in light of everything that's happened since Trump's been elected, all of the kind of misogyny and the racist arguments. You have comments, you have Charlottesville, you have the awful immigration policy and so forth. On the other hand, you can't count out the economy, right? The economy is doing really, really well. A lot of evangelicals may not vote on moral issues. They may vote on economic issues in 2020. But when you think about it this way, right, you don't need too many evangelicals to have their minds changed for a Democrat to win in 2020. I mean, Hillary won by 3 million votes, right? Popular vote. So, in places like Pennsylvania, which, where we saw in the 2018 midterms, we saw mostly Democratic candidates being elected, governor, senator, the Congress seats, many of them flipped to Democrat, place like Michigan and Wisconsin, you don't need too many votes to turn those states back towards a Democratic candidate. So I'm not, I'm kind of, a lot of people are saying, well, if the economy's good, Trump's going to win again. I'm not entirely convinced about that. At least if you can turn some evangelicals, you might have a chance to knock him off in 2020.
Well, here's a question then. If the Democrats have a nominee who is more likable than Hillary Clinton, do you think at least there will be a sizable, statistically significant number of evangelicals who will perhaps not vote for the Democrat, but feel like they don't have to vote for Trump?
Yeah. Hillary Clinton is a problem for white conservative evangelicals for 2 reasons. One is she represents everything about sort of what white evangelicals see as progressivism, right? Pro-choice, not doing much to defend Christian values, religious liberty, particularly marriage. She's big government and so forth. Any Democratic candidate that runs is going to have those same problems with white evangelicals, unless it's like a pro-life Democrat, right? Unless like Bob Casey from Pennsylvania runs, who evangelicals backed over Rick Santorum, right? And then drove Rick Santorum out. This is my home state, so I know these races pretty well. The other problem white evangelicals had with Hillary Clinton was that she was Hillary Clinton. The baggage, going back to the Bill scandals with Monica Lewinsky, going back to the lying and she's saying right-wing conspiracy and blah, 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 the deplorables line, Hillary Clinton made a lot of mistakes among white evangelicals. I don't think if she corrected those mistakes, she would have won over many white evangelicals to her side, but she may have turned some white evangelicals away from Donald Trump towards a third-party candidate or towards just not voting in the presidential election. So, we'll see what happens. You could have a Democrat who, if it's a traditional Democrat on the moral questions that evangelicals hold dear in 2020, I think they're not gonna vote for that Democrat, but because it's not Hillary Clinton, they may say, well, we could put up with this guy or this woman as opposed to, another 4 years of Trump.
I heard I don't remember who said this, but someone compared Hillary Clinton's sort of relationship as a cultural icon to the women's rights movement, to Jesse Jackson's relationship to the civil rights movement. And the argument was that in the same way that Jesse Jackson couldn't become president because of just all the baggage that comes with being part of that generation.
Yeah.
That someone from the second generation, like Obama, didn't have that baggage.
Yeah, yeah.
Hillary
Clinton, the next woman.
Right, is the argument that I've heard.
Possible.
Someone who would benefit from the women's rights movement, but not be associated with all the baggage that came with having to fight that fight.
Yeah,
in the 60s, 70s.
Yeah. No, there's probably some truth to that. We'll see. You know, I don't know how many women candidates are out there. You hear about Kamala Harris, Kristen Gillibrand. I mean, you know, we'll see what happens. I'm not sure. It's probably true.
Well, I forgot to mention at the start, but I will plug. You run a great blog that is also the title of your first book and the title of your podcast, which is
that's right.
Great. The Way of Improvement Leads Home. What's the URL? Is it Way of Improvement?
Wayofimprovement.com.
Wayofimprovement.com.
Yep.
No, that's not it.
Is it?
The Way of Improvement.
Let me.
Yes. Yeah, Way of Improvement.
Wayofimprovement.com. Sorry. I should know that.
I encourage people to check out your blog, check out your podcast, and you tweet at
John Fea 1.
John Fea 1?
Yep. JOHNFEA 1.
All right. Very good. Yeah, and I tweet at William R. Black. And in your book, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. It would be a good stocking stuffer.
There you go. When you have those conversations at Christmas, right? I did a promo for the book. I tweeted, I said, you just got done with these conversations over Thanksgiving with your pro-Trump evangelical friends, and you wish you had some more arguments for when Christmas or the December holidays come around, right? Get this book. You have a month to read it in preparation for Christmas dinner or whatever it might be.
Well, thanks for coming on. Love to have you on again sometime. And
great. Thanks for having me, Bill.
Thank you. Bye-bye.